The auctioneer banged the gavel down at $280 on a damp October morning in 2007 at the McDowell County Equipment Auction outside Welch, West Virginia. And the man in the heavy gold neck chains under the cinder-block office porch let out a deep belly laugh that rolled across the coal dust gravel lot like distant thunder and turned the heads of every coal hauler and shop mechanic standing along the chain link. Sterling Hanover, known across McDowell and Mercer counties as Sterl, was 53, 5'11", and broad as a bulldozer. Salt and pepper hair slicked back with pomade, clean-shaven jaw, dark, deep-set eyes glittering with cigar smoke, a small gold cap on his left front tooth. He wore a slate-gray western-cut sport coat over a black silk shirt, unbuttoned 3 deep, showing 3 heavy gold neck chains of graduating thickness, dark gray wool slacks, polished ostrich-skin cowboy boots, stitched in black, a wide hand-tooled leather belt with a heavy gold-plated coal-tipple buckle the size of a deck of cards, and a thick gold pinky ring on each hand. A half-smoked fat cigar sat between the index and middle fingers of his right hand. He owned Hanover Salvage and Recovery on U.S. Route 52 outside Bluefield, the largest salvage yard in the southern coalfields. He had personally bought every heavy wrecker in McDowell County for 19 years. The 1957 International Harvester KB-7 medium-duty wrecker at the back of the lot was the only piece of heavy iron Sterl had not been able to buy. The widow had refused him in 1991 and again in 1997. Now her estate lawyer had agreed to consign the truck so the bank could be paid. Sterl had told the auctioneer privately he would have offered the estate $200 because the cab roof had a 4-inch crease and the boom needed full recabling. The 24-year-old shop mechanic in the wet canvas coat at the back of the bidder's line had just outbid him for $280 against Sterl's casual $50 opening shot, and Sterl was making sure the coalfields understood the joke. Jonas Caudle folded the auction slip into the inside pocket of his oiled canvas chore coat and walked through the coal dust gravel to the truck. The KB-7 was 21 feet of heavy medium-duty conventional cab iron, the cab painted a faded international red, oxidized to a chalky brick rose along the body panels, and bone white along the upper edges of the doors, and a 4-inch dented crease ran across the passenger side cab roof where a timber had fallen on it in 1990. The chrome IH crown emblem on the front of the grille tarnished to a dull pewter, the chrome script International across the front of the long hood, pitted with green-gray corrosion, both side mirrors snapped off at the brackets. The original Holmes 750 wrecker, boom with a hand-cranked twin-drum winch mounted on the rear deck, listing 3 degrees right with both cables frayed and rusted, the wooden cargo deck planks rotted through, 3 of the 6 tires flat, and the word junk spray-painted in flaking gray-blue block letters across the driver's door. Jonas had grown up on a caudle holler 10 miles up Indian Creek from the truck's last parking spot. His grandfather, Garrett Caudle, was waiting at the trailer. Garrett was 78, a retired underground mine surveyor who had walked the Pocahontas No. 3 seam for 39 years, 5'11", lean and erect, with broad, bony shoulders and a surveyor's stoop, snow-white hair clipped short, a thick white mustache, deep, watery hazel eyes in a face lined by coal dust. Thick, black-rimmed reading glasses on a thin steel chain hung around his neck. He wore a heavy charcoal flannel-lined chamber shirt buttoned to the throat under a faded khaki canvas mine surveyor's chore vest, with 3 breast pockets and a felt-tip mine-tag pencil clipped to the left pocket, faded dark blue dungarees, scuffed black leather mine boots, and a battered gray wool flat cap pulled low. A small calabash pipe-stained walnut brown sat unlit between his teeth. A worn, brass-cased mine pocket knife slept in his right pants pocket. Garrett set one liver-spotted hand on the rusted fender and stood there a long minute. He spoke quietly. He said, "Son, you bought Caspar Brackenridge's old KB-7. Caspar Brackenridge had run Brackenridge Recovery out of a stone block shop on Wyoming Street in Welch from 1973 until the wall fell on him. He had pulled stuck coal trucks out of the steep red clay switchbacks above Davie and War, hauled crippled diesel haulers down off the backside of Big Creek Mountain, worked every coal hollow road from Iagar to Colwood for 17 years. He had built the Holmes 750 wrecker boom himself onto the KB-7's rear deck in 1974 with the help of 2 welders from the Pocahontas mine shops. He had married a Princeton girl named Beulah Trent in 1972, and they had a daughter, Adelaide, born in 1973. Caspar had died in June of 1990. A heavy 3-day summer storm had saturated the hillside behind his shop, and the cinder-block back wall of his bay had given way at 4 in the afternoon while he was changing the steering column bearings on his own KB-7. He had been pinned under 1,500 pounds of falling block and the upper corner of the cab roof. He was 52 years old. Adelaide was 17. The KB-7 had been recovered from the rubble with the cab roof creased and the boom intact and parked in the side yard. Beulah Brackenridge had refused Sterl Hanover when he came around in 1991 and again in 1997. The truck sat in the side yard for 17 years. Beulah had died in February of 2007, and the estate had agreed to consign the truck only because the bank required full liquidation. Jonas had been at the auction because his grandfather had heard from a mine equipment supplier in Bluefield that Caspar Brackenridge's truck was finally being sold. They winched the KB-7 onto Jonas's borrowed gooseneck trailer. Sterl Hanover stood under the cinder-block office porch and watched, the cigar still between his fingers. And as Jonas pulled out, he called across the gravel that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, Hanover Salvage and Recovery would buy the heap back for $50 cash. Jonas did not answer. Garrett climbed into the cab of the trailer truck, and they drove the 22 miles north up West Virginia Route 16, through the hollers to Garrett's railroad tie barn on a hilltop above Colwood, the dead KB-7 rocking behind them, the Holmes 750 booms pointing at the gray October Appalachian sky like 2 crooked fingers. The restoration would take 17 years. Nobody knew that on the drive up Route 16. Jonas worked his day job at a heavy truck shop in Bluefield during the week, and he drove the 40 minutes up to Garrett's barn every Saturday, and most Sundays. They started with the cab roof crease because Garrett insisted. They cut out the dented panel and welded in fresh 20-gauge sheet and primed the inside, and they straightened the cab corner posts on a slow-pulling chain hoist over 3 weekends. They pulled the IHB D282 inline-6 gasoline engine out of the truck and tore it down on a stand. The bearings were salvageable, the crank true, the head needed a careful regrind. They pulled the 5-speed manual and pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first long Appalachian winter went into the engine and into stories about Caspar Brackenridge. Garrett told Jonas about the night in 1979 when Caspar had pulled an overturned Mack DM600 coal truck out of an Anawalt switchback at 2 in the morning and refused payment except for 2 pounds of country ham. He told Jonas about the morning in 1984 when Caspar had hauled a snapped-eaten tag axle off the backside of Big Creek and let the mine foreman pay him in red oak firewood for the winter. He told stories about Beulah Brackenridge's apple butter biscuits. The second year, they sand-blasted the frame. By the 5th year, the cab was off. In the 7th year, Garrett's emphysema worsened, and he had a 3-month stay at the Welch 5A Medical Center. The truck sat under a tarp for a season. He came home thinner, with a small oxygen concentrator on a wheeled cart, but his hands still worked. He told Jonas the truck would wait. By the 9th year, the KB-7 was a roller. In the 11th year, Jonas's wife had their second child, and the work paused for a month. By the 12th year, Garrett sat more than he stood. He worked from a folding wooden chair beside the wood stove now, the calabash pipe still between his teeth, the oxygen line trailing along the concrete floor, and he pointed at what to do next. Through all those years, Sterl Hanover drove past the foot of Garrett's gravel road, sometimes in his polished black diesel 3/4 ton. The slate-gray western-cut sport coat visible through the windshield, and the truck always slowed at the bottom of the road but never quite turned in. By the 15th year, the KB-7 was painted. They had wet-sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy international red that matched a faded snapshot Garrett had of the truck from 1976, and they had masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking gray-blue junk paint still showed through, and they had left it there. Jonas did not know why. He just left it. By the 16th year, the Holmes 750 booms were rebuilt with fresh aircraft-grade twin-drum cables. By the 17th year, the KB-7 was nearly whole. They had not yet pulled the steering column for fresh column bearings. The steering work was the last thing on the list, because Garrett always said, "You start with what makes the truck move, and you finish with what makes the truck go where you point her." On a cool, clear morning of October the 12th of the 17th year, Jonas pulled into Garrett's barn with a fresh set of column bearings and a long brass drift. He was 41 years old. The dark brown at his temples had gone steady silver. The small white scar across his right knuckle from a creeperjack handle in 2014 was a faint line. His hands had the thickness of a man who had spent a third of his life under hoods. Garrett was 95. He sat on his folding wooden chair by the wood stove with a heavy plaid wool blanket over his knees. The battered gray wool flat cap pulled low, the calabash pipe still between his teeth, the small oxygen concentrator on a wheeled cart beside him. The thick black-rimmed reading glasses on the steel chain settled on his nose. Jonas pulled the steering column out of the KB-7 with the wheel attached. He set the long steel tube across 2 sawhorses. He started to slide the new bearings onto the column, and he stopped. The column tube felt heavier than it should at the firewall end. He set the bearings down. He took the column tube to the workbench and shook it gently. Something inside it rolled. He shone a clip-on lamp into the open end and saw, deep in the tube, the dull glint of solid brass. He took a soft brass drift and a small magnet from the bench drawer and gently fished out from the column tube a small brass tube the diameter of a $50 coin and 7 inches long, the seam at both ends soldered tight. He carried the brass tube to the workbench under the clip-on lamp and slit the lower seam with a heated putty knife and tipped the contents into his open palm. There were 4 things. There was a tight roll of folded $20 bills wrapped in a piece of waxed butcher paper, 75 bills in 1980s Federal Reserve paper, totaling $1,500. There was a small brass military pocket compass, the case engraved on the back with the words Ezra, H, Brackenridge, 32nd Infantry Division, 1918, in narrow block letters, the needle still pointing true under its slightly fogged glass. There was a small black and white photograph on stiff paperboard showing a young man in his early 20s in a campaign hat and World War I trench wool, standing in front of a sandbagged emplacement. The date, Saint-Mihiel, September 1918, written on the back in pencil. And there was a folded single sheet of plain yellowed lined paper, the creases brittle, the ink slightly faded but legible. Jonas unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was dated June the 4th of 1990. It read, "To my Adelaide. The cash is for whatever a young woman needs cash for at 18. The compass is your grandfather Ezra's. He carried it through the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918 and across the Rhine in 1919, and he gave it to me on my 18th birthday in 1956. The photograph is of him at Saint-Mihiel. I am soldering these inside the steering column because the hillside behind the shop has shifted 3 more inches this spring, and I am afraid the wall is going to come down before this storm season ends. The truck is yours when you are old enough to drive her without breaking her. Your father, Caspar Ezra Brackenridge, Welch, West Virginia, June 4th, 1990. Jonas sat on the workbench. He read the letter twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Garrett held it in both hands at arm's length to read through the thick reading glasses. He set the letter down. He said quietly, "Caspar wrote this 7 days before the wall came down." The girl never knew. They drove north to Charleston the next Saturday. Garrett had called a mine equipment supplier whose niece worked at the Kanawha County Courthouse, and the niece had found Adelaide Brackenridge Trent working as a senior court reporter in Judge Marston's chambers. They drove up West Virginia Route 16 and US 119 under a gray October Appalachian sky and pulled into the parking lot of a modest brick courthouse side office building on Court Street, where Adelaide kept her transcription office in a quiet ground-floor suite. The woman who came out of the inner office was 51 years old. She had Caspar Brackenridge's broad shoulders and her father's deep-set hazel eyes. She wore a charcoal gray wool blazer over a pale lavender silk blouse, slim charcoal trousers, low charcoal heels, and a thin silver crescent moon pendant on a silver chain at her throat. Garrett spoke first. He said, "Ma'am, I knew your father. He worked on his KB-7 in my barn in 1983. My grandson here bought the International at the spring auction over in Welch 17 years ago, and we have been restoring her ever since. And we found something soldered inside her steering column that belongs to you." Adelaide's face changed. She invited them into a small conference room, and they sat at a round oak table, and Jonas set the 4 items down one at a time. The cash first, then the compass, then the photograph. He saved the letter for last. Adelaide picked up the compass. She turned it slowly between her fingers and read the engraving on the back. She said her grandfather Ezra had come home from France with shell shock in 1919, that her father had told her stories about Ezra walking the railroad cuts between Welch and Niagara for 40 years afterward as a section hand, and that she had never seen a compass with his name on it. She picked up the WWI photograph. She held it for a long time. She read the letter twice. She did not cry until the second reading. She asked finally if she could see the truck. They drove her south to Coalwood the next morning. Adelaide stood in the open bay of Garrett's barn and walked slowly around the KB-7 3 times. She ran her hand along the chrome script International, across the long hood. She stood at the driver's door where the flaking gray-blue junk was still masked off in blue tape. She turned to Jonas, and she asked the price. Jonas looked at his grandfather. Garrett laid both hands on his knees and said, "Ma'am, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to finish her. We are going to paint over the door so the junk is gone. And then we are going to drive her down Route 16 to Wyoming Street in Welch and park her at the empty stone block lot where Brackenridge Recovery's bay stood until the wall fell on him. And we are going to paint your father's name on the door in clean white, the way he had it in 1973. The boy paid $280 at auction. The truck is his on the paper, the work is his by the doing, but the name on the door belongs to your father and your grandfather and to you." They finished the KB-7 through that winter. Adelaide drove down from Charleston every other Saturday. On the morning of April the 15th of the 18th year, they rolled the IHKB-7 out of Garrett's barn under a clear blue West Virginia sky, and they drove her in convoy down Route 16 to Wyoming Street in Welch, and parked her facing the empty stone block lot where Brackenridge Recovery had stood until June of 1990. Jonas handed Adelaide a small can of deep red paint and a 1-inch brush. Adelaide climbed up on the running board, and she painted out the flaking gray-blue junk on the driver's door. She waited an hour. She opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in her father's careful slant, she painted across the door in clean, clear letters. Brackenridge Recovery. Established 1973. Old enough to drive her without breaking her. She stepped down. A polished black diesel 3/4 ton went by on Wyoming Street. Sturl Hanover was driving. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the KB-7 at the empty stone block lot with the deep red door and the clean white lettering. He looked at the 4 people on the gravel. He did not laugh. He drove on. The KB-7 sits on Wyoming Street in Welch today, and the sign on the door reads, Brackenridge Recovery, established 1973. Adelaide Brackenridge Trent runs the senior court reporter's office at the Kanawha County Courthouse in Charleston. The $1,500 sits in a small lockbox at her office. The 32nd Infantry compass sits beside it. The 1918 photograph is framed on the wall above her desk. The letter is in a small fireproof safe at her house. She reads it once a year on the 4th of June. If you ever see an old International KB-7 parked on a Welch street with the words Brackenridge Recovery painted on the door in clean white, slow down. Roll the window down and listen. There is a story in that truck that a man in 3 gold neck chains tried to buy back for $50, and the work was always for the daughter. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.